I wanted to talk about my journey writing this book about microphones. And it begins with the book that my partner Chris Johnson and I wrote. And where is Chris? He's that guy back there.
Oh, man.
we wrote a book called Recording Unhinged, and it's unconventional recording techniques. It's a fun book. We wrote it, it's been about 4 years, 5 years since it's come out, okay. And it's done pretty well. Our publisher was very pleased at how it was doing. And so he gave us another task. He said, can you write a book about microphones? Vintage microphones, like the history of vintage microphones. And I thought, of course, right? What's so hard about that? I know a lot about microphones. I have a lot of microphones. But as soon as I started talking to people about it, you know, the people that I thought would be able to give me information about mics and their history, then I got this. People said, it can't be done. There's too many mics. There's too many, you know, it just goes on, and it's true. There's mics that we don't even think about in everyday use. I'm just hearing about a mic that's in a smoke alarm. There's a mic in there. I didn't know that. There's mics in our phones. There's, you know, things that we take for granted. Anyway, so it can't be done. And we thought, well, we're going to do it anyway. So my first stop was at the BBC in London, and I wanted to document the collection, the archive that they have there, that includes some mics, some really historic mics that were part of the UK history, including this one. And I went to their archives and I got access to photograph the collection. This mic was used by King Edward VIII when he did his abdication speech. When he was given the choice of either be king or marry his love, who was Wallis Simpson, who was an American divorcee. And the church did not want that to happen, so he had to make a decision. He decided he would not be king. That was a big deal, and that's when Queen Elizabeth came in. So, King Edward VIII used those microphones for his abdication speech, and that was at Windsor Castle in 1936. So I got to photograph that. I'm like, oh, good. This is a fantastic thing for the book, right? Then I went on to Neumann's headquarters in Berlin, and there I got to see where they designed and built the 47, the 49, the 87. These are workhorse mics that everyone loves today, and they're really recognizable. I went into the shop and met this fellow, Medzig Viselli, and he showed me how he works on these. He's still repairing and providing parts and service for the M49s from 50 years ago. So that was a good experience. But then there's more to that story, because apparently Neumann during the war, the Second World War, was bombed, and the factory was destroyed. And so George Neumann moved his factory to a little town called Gefell. So I went to this place. They are still making microphones. They were making microphones under the name of Neumann while George was there, until he died. And I think it was, I have to say that they stopped using the name Neumann in the 70s because George moved back to Berlin, reopened Neumann, and that's the company that we know today. So the Neumann in Berlin was making the 47, but the Neumann in Gefell was making a whole other variety of mics. But under Soviet rule, they had to change the name of the mic from Neumann to RFT. So typically anything that says RFT could have come from this factory. It was kind of a general branding of anything coming out of the Eastern Bloc during that era. Some of these Eastern Bloc mics are very desirable. I have a friend in Dresden that has these mics in his collection, which is, that's an MWL mic, the bottle on the left, CMV 563, which is a Neumann branded mic that came out of Gefell. And then the RFT 7151, which is also it's an RFT. It's Eastern Germany, and it could have come out of the Gefell factory, but we're not sure. Today, the Gefell factory has a new name. It's Microtech Gefell, and they're well represented around, and they still make fantastic mics. But that's the history. There was a battle between the Neumann name for several years between these two companies. Then I went to Shure. I went to Chicago, and Shure has a big factory in Chicago, very impressive company. And I got to really hang out there for a while. I saw their production and saw their collection of vintage mics that they have, including this 57, which was used by Jimi Hendrix on stage. And of course, they have it in a glass case. And Michael Pedersen, who's the historian there at Shure, brings it out in white kit gloves, cotton gloves, and which is so funny because the 57s don't need to be handled with kit gloves, but this one gets a special treatment. Then I went to visit Aspen Pittman, and he was a legend. He unfortunately passed away this year, but I met with him before his accident, and I saw his collection. Part of his collection includes this mic. It's an AKG C12 that was used by Whitney Houston in the song. Why will always love you. We all know that song. Then Chris and I went to London, and we went to Abbey Road, where we met this fellow. This is Lester Smith. He's basically the historian and takes care of the mic collection for Abbey Road, and has done it since the 70s. Wonderful man. He showed us around and gave us showed us some of the special mics in the collection, including this STC. This is 4033, I think. I think it's a 4033. Does anyone know? We'll say it's a 4033. He also showed me this 47, which had a windscreen on it that was made especially for John Lennon, because John specifically asked for this type of screen. And so they use it still today. It's the same one that John Lennon used. Then I went to Capitol Records and visited their collection and met with this fellow, who's Al Schmidt, who's a legend. And he showed me Capitol's, one of his favorite mics. It's nicknamed Frank. It's a U48 Neumann. And it's nicknamed Frank because this is the mic that Frank would always want to use. And that's Al, a young Al Schmidt, working with Frank at Capitol. Then I went back to London because there was one more thing I wanted to see in the archives at EMI, and that was a collection. That's me taking photos in the EMI archives. There's a collection of microphones that were made particularly for the royal family. These are unbelievable. They're made with silver and gold and filigree. This one particularly for Queen Elizabeth. It has the E with the crown right on it. That was an amazing experience. I truly love these mics, and I learned so much, but I didn't learn everything. There's so much more. Oh my God, maybe it is impossible. I don't know. But this is a Bloomline mic that Bloomline used to work for EMI during this time, and the 30s, 20s and 30s, and this was the first stereo ribbon mic designed by Bloomline, and that is in the archive at EMI. So I'm documenting all these things for the book. And then my manager, Chris, he says, will you go up to this place? It's in Milwaukee. It's an hour drive. You're in Chicago right now, so why don't you just drive up there and say hello to this fellow who has a collection of mics. It's supposed to be a mic museum there. So I went up and met this fellow. His name's Bob Paquette, and he has a mic museum. And this place blew my mind. There's mics from all over the world, starting from the beginning through about the 70s. I think he stopped collecting in the 70s, and then he perfected each one of these entries into his complete mic collection. It's astounding. It's really beyond words. these mics. There's carbons, there's crystals, there's ribbons, tons of ribbons, all the RCA collection. And mics you've never seen before, and mics I certainly have never seen before. Unfortunately, my first visit, I didn't bring my camera with me, and I didn't have enough time to spend with Bob there. So I made a plan to come back and visit Bob again, and I'd bring my camera. Unfortunately, Bob Paquette died months after my visit. I was in contact with his family, and I felt it was really important to try to find a place, a home for these mics, a buyer for the collection that would not sell it off, you know. The family was interested in that also. So Chris, my partner, went up there to see the museum. And he went to see what could be done as far as, I tried to find a home for the museum, and I came up to a dead end with that. So Chris went up and talked to the family, and this is what happened. We bought the museum.
Wow.
We're out of our minds. So Chris went back. He emptied out the whole museum, put it into boxes, put the boxes into storage containers, shipping containers, and drove one of them across country. And this is just unbelievable. He drove this, how big was this truck?
Maybe a 30, 40-foot truck.
Yeah, 40-foot truck across the country, plus we had another shipping container shipped by pods. So 2 huge shipping containers traveling across the country in the middle of the winter. So I started unwrapping these mics from their boxes. He brought, you know, we could only bring in a few boxes at a time into our home, which is not that big. And we would open up a box, and I would say, oh, wow, this is great. I know what this is, I think. And then I would go online and look it up and then inventory it. And then pulled this one out. And I thought, well, this is unusual. It must be old. It looks like an old telephone. And then I opened it up, and it was empty. And I thought, oh, someone took the guts out of it, right? So, you know, because that... You know, what happened to this mic? It's not complete. And Chris looks at it and he said, no, you better do some more research. This is the element. This is the mic. That is the mic. And I was like, what? What? It's like, how could this be the element? Okay, so I did some research. This is like when I realized that everything that I knew about everything was wrong. I had to start over from the beginning. This is the original carbon mic. Okay, so I had to go back. I had to understand, well, I was like, well, wait a minute. Who was first? Well, Alexander Graham Bell made a liquid transmitter in 1876. And it was like a cone that had some kind of liquid and some kind of oil or something. And then the vibrations of that liquid would transmit. And it was not very good. So apparently, this guy, David Edward Hughes, decided he had a better idea, and this was his design. He took a carbon pencil, that's a carbon pencil, had it set upright like this, and yes, carbon. This is, you can see here is a demonstration of the pencil microphone. This is a carbon pencil microphone. Here's your pencil, and then on one side you have a lead going to a battery, like a 6 to 10 volt, basically, DC. And then on the other pole, you put this little headset, so you listen like this. And I'm like, okay, that's crazy. You start yelling at a rock and then you get sound. Everything I knew about microphones was wrong at that point. But in fact, it's true. That was our first carbon mic, the carbon pencil microphone. And immediately, David Edward Hughes was a celebrity. He had already been inventing other things. So he said, this is my gift to the world. He decided not to patent it. He did get written up for this invention, but in fact, he did not patent it because he wanted it to to be a gift to the world, which was a wonderful thing for him to do. Of course, inventors are assholes. So right away, Berliner, who's not all a bad guy, but Berliner and this guy, Thomas Edison, started bickering about how they were going to patent this thing. And Berliner made a carbon button microphone, which was a little better than the carbon pencil. And then he and Thomas Edison started fighting about that. So Thomas Edison won. So Thomas Edison gets the credit for the carbon microphone, even though everybody knows it was actually David Edward Hughes that was the first. And Edward Hughes, he's credited with it, but he did not get the patent for it. Next, this guy Fessenden, and his name is Reginald Fessenden, later in 1906, made a way of taking carbon like this and making it into granules and then suspending that. And that was a better way. There was more power that could be, more volume, a clearer volume, clearer, you could hear it better, in other words. So Fessenden's invention improved the microphone, and this was the first Fessenden microphone with a granulated carbon element. So things were happening so quickly at this time that new inventions were being brought forth every day, and improvements were done quite quickly. So the next improvement was this basic microphone, which is a carbon button on the inside, like the one that Berliner designed. But this one is called the tomato can, and this was a very popular mic in early radio. Radio was exploding in the teens and really expanded in the 20s, where amateurs could build their own radio sets just using instructions. There were no pre-made radio sets in the teens. You had to order parts and put it together yourself. So everybody was doing it, and kids were just so into this. So there was magazines on and how they could tinker and make these things, and the radio waves exploded, and there were so many amateurs out there making radios and making them badly that all the frequencies on the radio spectrum were just mucked up, and it caused chaos because the Titanic sunk in the late teens. Because part of it, the rescue operation was hampered because they could not communicate because of the amateurs blocking the signals. So at that point, they were nicknamed hacks or hams. So ham radio, these are the amateurs that are building their own sets. And suddenly, immediately after the Titanic sank, there were restrictions on who could get licenses and how these things, what part of the spectrum they could be used in. But this is a very exciting time in the teens and 20s, and the technology was just exploding. This is another type of carbon, and you can see the photo here. This was a Marconi, from the Marconi labs in London. And Marconi worked for the BBC. Generally, there was the BBC was a conglomerate of several companies, including the Marconi labs. Marconi would make the radio equipment for people who you would have to actually subscribe to a radio station at BBC in order to use the equipment. You had to have a subscription and pay for it. You had to have only equipment that was built by BBC approved, which would be Marconi or Western Electric or these companies. But so Marconi made this out of a design that was done by Reese. This is the Reese microphone, and this is the Marconi design. And this particular mic was made for Japanese radio, which was just happening at that same time. So this is in the, what year was this? Let me double check. This is in the early 20s. So these carbon ring microphones were really popular in the 20s. They're all carbons. They're all the granulated carbon that Fessenden developed from the Hughes original design. But at the same time, there were other things happening. Telephones were were becoming a daily part of life. And these carbon mics, you'll know, have been used and are still used today. This one, the carbon that started here is in everyone's typical phone. This is from the 60s and 70s and 80s, but there's these carbon buttons are still used today. You'll know from if you follow anything that I do or in the book, I do a lot of homemade microphones, taking apart old telephones and using them in recording sessions. It's a lot of fun. All you need to do is just power one side with a 1.5 volt battery, and then you have a line level microphone just using the mouthpiece from a telephone. It's easy and fun. But the next thing, the things didn't all happen in order. In fact, they were happening simultaneously. The development of the condenser mic was a new idea that happened just as carbon was coming up. I mean, while they were all the stations were using these type of mics, but other companies were making these types of mics, and these were condensers, and they're a lot more expensive to make. So they didn't become as popular. This is a German make, and it's unbranded. A lot of the condensers that you can find from this era were unbranded because, again, people were just building them. They would take parts. You could order it in these mail order catalogs, and you could build your own. So I'm not sure who did make this mic, but it's a German make. Condensers continued to develop. The first condenser was built by Western Electric, by this fellow, E.C. Wente. And first at Western Electric had some very popular carbon microphones. So this is one of their final, I think it's a 387 carbon. But immediately after that, Wente took the same idea, the suspended capsule, and made a condenser microphone. Now that condenser capsule would be connected to an amplifier. As things progressed, the amplifier was built into the base. So now it wasn't suspended anymore on a separate stand. The amplifier was built into the base, and that's the basis for a lot of the bottle mics that came soon after that, including the Neumann CMV3 or the 7151 RFT that I had up there before, and other similar bottle mics. All were basically using the amplifier that was in the body. But the big, and you'll see like the very first amplifiers were attached to the spring mounting. This is a Western Electric mic using Wente's design. Then it developed into more of a tombstone style with the amplifier in the base. And then Western Electric's 47A, which was the standard for all the other bottle mics of the time. And this was a very popular mic, the first 47.
Wow.
Yeah. At the same time, a company named AEG in Germany was also developing, this was the predecessor to the Telefunken condensers of the day. They used Western Electric capsules to start building their own version of a condenser mic. But they were kind of slow on the draw. They were behind the Americans as far as that went, because at the same time they were working on this, Western Electric was already streamlining their bottles, right? So they went from that 47A with this big bulky body. Now they have this streamlined thing with this very small capsule here, which is called a 640 AA. And that became the standard for a long time. Here's what Germany was doing at that same time. They were still working with the bottle with the condenser top. And this is a very beautiful mic, I have to say. So it still sounds great today. And the 47A sounds great today too. But the Western Electric was really on the cutting edge, and they began slimming down the body of the microphone soon after that. And it went from a long capsule to a shorter capsule. Finally, this is very modern. This is also using the 640 AA, but this kind of is where Western Electric brought us to the modern condenser today. This particular mic is a Synchron, Synchron AU7, and this was the first that didn't use a tube power supply. This used, this was effect, field effect transistor, right? Yes. And so this was the first, and it's American. I always thought maybe Neumann was the first one to use the phantom power, but in fact Synchron was the first. Synchron was a company that didn't last very long. But Fairchild, the company that makes the 670 compressor, the stereo compressor that everybody loves, they put their name on this. So you can find these, they're called Fairchild, it might be the AU7 also. Anyway, you'll find these with it, Fairchild. If you see one of those, get it. You can find it. It's a good mic. All right. Let's talk about ribbons briefly. The ribbon mic was also happening at the same time all these other technologies were happening. Some of the first, the first official ribbon mic that was popular was this built by Schottky and Gerlach, who's a couple of Germans, and this was the Seaman and Halsky ribbon mic from 1923. So see, all these things were happening in the early 20s. Technology was exploding during this time. And people loved the ribbons because of the higher, the larger frequency range that they offered. So this fellow, Harry F. Olson, worked for RCA. And RCA wanted to have a popular ribbon mic that they could market to radio and in particular the Radio City Music Halls. And so they first of all, the first Harry Olson design was this called a PB17 RCA. So that you see it's similar to the bottle with the condenser. It has the amp built into it. But they decided they didn't need that amp on there anymore. So Harry developed this, which was the PB31. And the PB31 was the first really successful ribbon mic. It's an RCA. There were 50 built for the Radio City Music Hall. There's only a few around today, but they are around. You can find them on eBay. Maybe it's going to be expensive, but they still sound great. Harry F. Olson started immediately working on his next design, which is the RCA 44, and this is a prototype. So he was still trying to figure out what kind of profile it would have. And this profile, of course, became one of the most famous mics that we know today, RCA 44. But Harry F. Olson, he was continuing to design these mics through the 30s, and through the 20s and 30s, and all the way through the 50s. And this was a prototype of what became another really popular design, the RCA DX 77DX, 77, 77D, and then the DX. A very iconic design and beautiful mic that many people still use today. I mean, the last session I was on at East West last week had a pair of 44s for room mics. You know, I mean, they're still just really useful mics. Harry F. Olson also developed this prototype, which was incredibly a prototype for the BK5. BK5 is a mic that actually is end address. So it was supposed to be set up like this. And ultimately it became this. This is the RCA BK5, also a ribbon mic. And also still today, a fantastic mic for recording. Next, let's talk about dynamics. Dynamics also, while everything else was happening, the dynamics were also in development. One of the earliest dynamic designs was this one by, built in the Marconi labs by Captain Round and Sykes. So it's called the Round Sykes Marconi mic from 1923, and it's a dynamic. And the king, let's see, here's Captain Round here in his lab at Marconi. The first broadcast using this dynamic mic was Beatrice Harrison in a garden outside with her birds. And it was called, what was it called? The Morning, Meadowlark, or, yeah, the Meadowlark recording, or the Meadowlark broadcast. It was legendary, where the listeners on the radio program could hear bees buzzing. The detail of the microphone was so great. It was astounding to everybody. And while I was at EMI, I saw this in the archive. And this is the Marconi Round Sykes mic, dynamic, built for, this is King George V. And you can see, this is actually that Round Sykes mic underneath this cover. It's not a very sexy cover, but they needed a windscreen that day. And later on, they actually made a much nicer windscreen out of silver filigree for the king. So we didn't have that ratty thing anymore. The dynamics developed soon after that. Western Electric, again, winning the race, built this dynamic mic, which became the regular mic for so many broadcasts. You can see FDR here, and there's a whole array of these guys. See, that's the one. It's the same thing. And this one, what is the one? 618A. Yeah, the 618A was a really popular mic, and you can still buy these, and they work great. They're kind of limited with the frequency range today, but I just used that one on the session last week. It was great. Popular designs, dynamics, because of the simplicity of the design, you didn't need to have an amplifier built into the body of the mic. So the dynamic mics in the 50s became very colorful and fantastic with their designs, and this. So this, I should identify this mic. This is a Shure 55 mic, the Fat Boy, as it's like to be known as, the Fat Boy. This is another dynamic mic that was made by EV. It is the 666 mic of the devil. But yeah, it wasn't all that bad, actually. Very popular mic for the time, not only for speech, but also for music. Other dynamics that have been classics over the years, this is a very popular one, the Sennheiser MD421. And Robert Kennedy on that one. Crystal mics. Now, crystal mics kind of came out of nowhere. Because, and this is one of these things that just blows my mind again. All right, so you yell at a rock and you get sound, right? You're yelling at a rock. All right, this still blows my mind. Okay, crystals totally blow my mind. Here's Charles Francis Bush, Sr. and his son. They were developing different things. Now, Sr., he was already rich. He invented the arc light, which was the predecessor to popular incandescent lighting, and was very popular for public areas in the 1800s. So he built this huge mansion and had a laboratory in the basement. He and his son were tinkering around with different things. And they found out that crystals, quartz crystals, when you cut them a certain way, and you take that crystal and you bend it, it puts out a charge. Okay, so this is blowing my mind, right? Did you know you could bend a rock and there's a charge? I did not know. This is piezoelectricity, okay? Everyone's like, hey, Sylvia, it's piezoelectricity. I'm like, what? Bending a rock? Okay, so they slice a crystal and suspend it so that the diaphragm of a mic will ever so slightly bend that flattened piece of crystal, and the tiny charge that comes out of it is what you have for a signal. This is, the brushes then developed their crystal microphone, their piezoelectric mics, and they look like brushes. I thought, isn't that funny that they actually kind of look like brushes? So these are a couple of brush mics. The problem with the brush mics is that they're a little funny it takes a lot of precision to actually cut these crystals, for one. But you can make them out of Rochelle salt, and you and I can build our own piezoelectric crystals by just doing, there's a recipe, you can make these crystals, you can cut them, and you can make your own crystal mics with piezoelectricity if you want. There's a bit of a challenge with that, in that that they leak, they get moisture and then they stop working. But there are many types of brush mics. This is another type of brush mic that was really popular. And these also became very fantastic. This is the D104. This is not a brush mic, but it's made by Aesthetic. Aesthetic, this may be the most popular mic in the world. It was manufactured from, I think the 1930 all the way through the 90s, in fact. I mean, you can find these. D104, remember that. It's a crystal mic. More chances than not, they won't work. Just because these crystals stop working after a while. But they're so fantastic. Why not just put this beautiful piece of art on your shelf, you know? And then the harmonica mics. That's also that crystal, that classic bullet harmonica mic is also one of these types of crystals. But you can see here, this is the element of a crystal mic that has kind of exploded. It got wet and expanded, and then it's just, this is what a broken crystal looks like. You can fix them, you can get replacements, but yeah, too bad about that. So, the impossible book, right? Well, it turns out that Mr. Bob Paquette, who we bought his collection from, had been trying to write the same book since 1975. So, and luckily Chris and I have all his notes. He did write this book, but we're going to improve it. We're so thankful to be a part of the process of writing the book for the ages. This is part of Bob's collection. And all the files of every kind, you know, and books, just the rarest of rare books. You know, so I just have to say, from me and Chris, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. And stay tuned, because the great vintage microphone book will be finished sometime mid-year and will be out next year. And thanks for listening to my little presentation.